Hello, I'm George Denison, a broadcaster at 4Player Network, and these are my top 10 games of 2014. When it comes to pure, simple fun, few games have managed to beat Vlambeer's incredibly addictive arcade-style shooter Luftrausers. It's hard to convey the appeal of the game through footage, because what makes this game so enjoyable is how it controls. Your ship handles sort of like asteroids with gravity, and can dodge through the countless bullets and missiles the game throws at you with ease thanks to its elegant and responsive control system. There's also a smart health mechanic, which allows your ship to repair itself automatically provided you aren't firing, which adds a tactical element and means you aren't simply holding down the fire button for the entirety of the game. It might effectively have one mode, but there's a strong sense of progress from gradually unlocking new parts of your ship. Start unlocking the game's 125 possible ship part combinations and the fun really begins, as you can manufacture everything from a plane that fires bullets out of its tail on acceleration to one that fires homing missiles and is strapped with a nuclear bomb that causes your score to skyrocket on death. While it's possible to find a combination that works and stick to it, I find it's more fun to put everything on random and just see what crazy new set of variables you end up with on each playthrough. The cherry on the cake is a fantastic soundtrack that starts with a catchy techno beat, and as the intensity ratchets up and the screen fills with battleships, blimps and rockets, changes to a rousing orchestral fanfare that makes the game feel strangely cinematic. To put it simply, narrowly dodging through a volley of bullets before blowing a battleship out of the water with a giant laser whilst trumpets blare in the background feels awesome. The game is a little insubstantial overall when it comes to content, but there's no denying that Luftrausers has provided some of the most entertaining hours of gaming I've had this year. Like the best arcade shooters, it always calls you back for one more go, and another. And another, and another, and another, and another, and another. I'm a little surprised that Titanfall ended up on this list, not because I didn't think it would be a good game, but because I'm generally not that interested in online multiplayer shooters. Although it can superficially resemble market-dominating shooters like Call of Duty, Titanfall does a few things differently and manages to stand apart from the crowd. Firstly, there's the parkour system. The mobility of the pilots you control help the action to feel consistently fast and fluid, and combined with some tight map design, jumping and wall running around the stages makes the game a ton of fun to play before you've even started shooting anything. Then there's the grunts and spectres, AI bots that help maps always feel like they are full of activity and not completely dominated by a handful of pro players. It's true that they are incredibly thick and little more than target fodder, but they give newer players something to shoot at and help everyone to feel like they're continually gaining points towards their next Titan, even when they're having a streak of bad luck against human competition. Finally, there's the Titans themselves, which are satisfying to pilot and strike a nice balance of being weighty enough to feel powerful, but agile enough not to feel cumbersome. They do a great job of changing up the dynamics of a match when they arrive, and calling in a Titan, watching it fire out of the sky and crash into the ground before jumping into the cockpit in one fluid motion never gets old. Whether you're trampling pilots with a well-timed dash or catching bullets out of the air to fire back at your opponent, the Titans are great fun to use and don't disappoint. What is disappointing is the campaign, which lacks ambition and is little more than just some background noise playing over otherwise standard multiplayer matches. The general lack of content is also a letdown considering the game's price. Yet despite its flaws, what I did play of Titanfall this year was hugely entertaining, and the game kept me coming back for match after match, which is more than could be said for most of the online shooters I've played recently, so it's going in at number 9 on my top 10 list. Valiant Hearts: The Great War is a rare game that is set during World War I that is not focused on combat. Ubisoft's adventure game strives to provide an interactive experience that shows a side to warfare outside of gunplay and tactics, and for the large part they succeed. By following a specific set of characters through various scenarios taking place across the timeline of the war to end all wars, Ubisoft have managed to create an experience that feels personal and relatable, whilst also utilising a range of flexible mechanics, which are generally puzzle focused. The puzzles are never hugely challenging, but are enjoyable to solve and do a nice job of immersing you in the story they have created, even if some are contrived Valve-turning puzzles. The game's other mechanics are a mixed bag, and some feel like strange design decisions, including healing soldiers turning into a rhythm action game for some reason, but overall they create a diverse and unique take on interactive storytelling within the war genre. The real star of the show here is the art style. The game looks stunning in motion, with its comic book aesthetic that is full of charm and character. In fact, I go as far as to say that this is the best looking game of 2014. There's also the comic book style panels, which are used to fantastic effect to show players things taking place off screen during gameplay, whether it is the face of a dying soldier as you rush to find medicine for him, or where gunfire is coming from as you run through the trenches. When the game was first revealed, one of the things I was concerned about was that the game might not be able to strike a comfortable tone with its cartoonish look, yet heavy subject matter. Thankfully my fears were unfounded. Valiant Hearts manages to remain respectful towards its subject matter and avoids glamorising war, whilst never being overly morbid with its approach. However, the game doesn't pull its punches when it wants to make an impact on the player, and I found the game's final moments to be incredibly powerful. The game definitely has its issues, and its mechanics don't quite come together as coherently as I'd liked, but Valiant Hearts nonetheless left a lasting impression on me in a way that many other games didn't, so it's one of my top 10 games of the year. In a year of painfully predictable sequels, a game that provides the kind of surprises that The Vanishing of Ethan Carter does should absolutely be celebrated. The best thing about this first-person adventure game is its compelling sense of mystery, as it drops you into a lush and atmospheric open environment with the task of investigating the disappearance of a young boy. That's all you know, the rest is for you to discover. I won't give anything away, as this, much like the Stanley Parable from last year, is a game best experienced knowing as little about it as possible. All I'll say is the game transcends genres from horror to thriller to sci-fi to drama, and throws a number of curveballs to knock your ideas of what might be going on completely off track. It keeps you guessing right until the very end, and it's the mystery that will keep you playing on. I love how the game presents you with new ideas with every scenario you stumble across, from pen and paper puzzle solving to crime scene reconstruction, and one particularly terrifying sequence that had my palms sweating as much as any encounter I've had in Outlast. It's also great that you can solve its mysteries in any order you want, allowing you to explore its richly detailed world and story and piece it together on your own terms. Some of its puzzles lack depth, and I felt the resolution of the plot wasn't quite as satisfying as I had hoped, but The Vanishing of Ethan Carter had me hooked from the start and effortlessly compelled me to solve its mysteries. I thoroughly recommend it.
You have to help us. It's the only way.
Considering Supergiant Games were responsible for the indie hit Bastion, I was expecting nothing less than stellar presentation with their follow-up game, Transistor. They delivered, and then some. Let's get this out of the way. Transistor looks and sounds phenomenal. Its Blade Runner-esque dystopian city is rich with colour and detail, and of course, Darren Korb's wonderful soundtrack provides the perfect moody atmosphere for exploring it, and his distinctive style of acoustic and trip-hop make for, I'm going to say this now, the best soundtrack of the year. Ashley Barrett's beautiful vocals are also absolutely worth mentioning, and the songwriting on the soundtrack, particularly the credits song, is brilliant. Look, if you aren't interested in buying Transistor because of the gameplay, fine, but you must buy the soundtrack. It's really good. So what about the gameplay? Well, personally, I really enjoyed it. It's not without flaws. It seems reliant on a cover system that isn't quite robust enough to support the frenetic combat, and I'd say my skill set often felt slightly overpowered. Yet the combination of real-time and turn-based combat works well, giving the player a nice sense of control over the combat's pacing. You can wail on small enemies in real time, but when tougher enemies get wheeled out, you have the option of pausing and planning a temporary strategy using your available skills. The game really comes into its own when you start unlocking more and more abilities, and I had a great time experimenting with the different combinations of powers you could set up. I liked how the game's health system, where some abilities are lost if you take too much damage and can't be regained until you've made a certain amount of progression, can force players to move outside of their comfort zone and not become complacent with one style of play. In general, it's really fun to mess around with, and having the skills be so flexible that you can completely change your setup from one fight to the next, rather than feeling like you have to commit to certain playstyles and skill trees, was something I really appreciated. Initially the plot left me cold, but after unlocking more of the characters' backstories in New Game Plus, I started to get sucked in more and more by the lore of the game. While I think it could benefit from being slightly more coherent in its execution, I felt that the world and characters of Transistor ended up being even more interesting than Bastion's, which is no mean feat. I'd love to see some sort of sequel or spiritual successor to Transistor, but whatever they end up working on next, Supergiant Games certainly have my attention based on the games they've released so far. Season 1 of the Walking Dead adventure game series by Telltale Games was my game of the year for 2012. It ended up on many of our 2012 end of year lists here at 4Player Network and was met with unanimous praise from players, so it's safe to say that Season 2 had some fairly high expectations to live up to. Did Telltale manage to surpass or even match the highs of Season 1? No. Is Season 2 still really good? In my opinion, yes. It can be easy to take some of the best qualities of Telltale's game for granted. For one thing, The Walking Dead boasts some of the most emotive and expressive voice acting you'll hear from games this year, including another fantastic performance from Melissa Hutchison as Clementine. Telltale know how to make you care about their characters in this universe through well-written dialogue and, just as importantly, their excellent dialogue system, which allows you to take part in conversations at a fluid pace in a way that feels comfortable and natural. And of course, the comic book in motion visual style still looks great. But you know all this already, because it's what made Season 1 such an unforgettable experience. Aside from some minor control tweaks, Telltale have made barely any changes to their winning formula, but what about the story? That's what makes or breaks a modern Telltale experience after all. In fact, story, I would argue, was what made Telltale's The Wolf Among Us a less engaging experience than The Walking Dead, despite those games being mechanically identical. All I can say is that the story of Season 2 gripped me from start to finish, and that was all I needed. It wasn't perfect. I felt some characters were killed off too hastily before they were allowed to properly develop, but there's still plenty of nail-biting "oh shit" moments where the rug is pulled from under your feet and you're suddenly required to make difficult decisions under a pressurized time limit. Telltale are masters when it comes to putting you between a rock and a hard place, and as with the first season, I found myself making split-second decisions only to regret them later on. And I felt this way because I cared about the characters. Again, maybe not as much as the characters in the first season, but enough to make me feel like my conversations and interactions with them mattered. The second season takes the series into even darker territory than before, with Clementine having to make her own way in a hostile world with a new group of people who she doesn't know if she can trust. Even the one returning character from Season 1 is changed to the point where you aren't sure if you feel the same about them. This season continues to hammer home that the threat in The Walking Dead isn't just the zombies, but the other survivors as well. Best of all, Telltale finished the season with a series of possible branching endings so that even though your choices up until that point have limited impact on the narrative, you can still end the game on a note that can be radically different to that of other players. Season 2 might not have been as good as Season 1, but hey, most things aren't, and I still enjoyed this season enough for it to be in my top 5 games of this year.
What could I do? She thought I was her best friend. I couldn't go unpunished.
Genuinely good video game comedy is hard to come by, so thank God for funny games like Jazzpunk. Visually, Jazzpunk has a 30 Flights of Lovin' vibe to it, and like that game, it's a first-person adventure of sorts, but what it reminds me of in the best way possible is WarioWare. Jazzpunk shares WarioWare's surreal blend of varied game styles, slapstick comedy and irreverent throwbacks to classic games. There's not really much of a logical narrative. Jazzpunk is happy to throw you into its playground of interactive jokes and let you have fun, and it's so packed with gags that like Airplane or a good episode of The Simpsons, you're still laughing at the last punchline when the next one shows up, and they're all funny. That's what's impressive about Jazzpunk. Almost all of its jokes land, and they run the gamut of comedy from fart humour to movie references to violent slapstick to puns to absurdist sight gags and just about anything else they could think of that made for a good laugh. Within a couple of minutes you'll have thrown a man shaped like a bathroom sign off a bridge, pushed over a queue of people like a line of dominoes, accidentally dismantled a robot and played Frogger to help a talking frog get free Wi-Fi. This is the level of rapid-fire insanity you can expect from Jazzpunk, and while every new idea it introduces is throwaway by nature, it makes for an experience that is constantly creative and brilliantly unpredictable. Jazzpunk is very short, and there's little reason to play it more than once, but I haven't laughed this hard at a game in, well, forever, so it's going in on my top 10 list.
I have 4th degree burns all over my entire face.
The Talos Principle is a late entry on this list, but I'm glad I managed to squeeze in the time to play this excellent first-person puzzler. The game has been compared to Portal a lot, and while its puzzles share Portal's test chamber-like structure, the key difference is that the Talos Principle gives you far more freedom to tackle its challenges in a non-linear order, so if you get stuck on one, there's always plenty more you can have a go at. With over 120 puzzles, the Talos Principle isn't short on content, but this isn't quantity over quality. Each of its puzzles works around a new idea that stretches what can be done with its handful of mechanics a little further, and it rarely, if ever, feels like it's repeating itself. What I really like is how this game features enough tools and puzzle mechanics to keep things varied, but each idea is explored and expanded upon extensively across a gentle difficulty curve that steadily combines mechanics to create more and more complex trials. It's only towards the end of the game that you're introduced to some really tricky stuff, but almost all the puzzles require at least some degree of lateral thinking, and they are always satisfying to solve. Device jamming and laser refracting is cool, but my favourite idea that the game introduces is the record mechanic, where you record a version of yourself that can alter puzzle elements in an alternate timeline, and can then be played back, effectively allowing a past version of yourself to work alongside you solving the puzzles. It's a little difficult to explain, but it makes for some of the trippiest and mind-bending puzzle solving I've experienced since Braid, and the puzzles that featured this mechanic were easily my favourite. The game also features a very interesting narrative that is uncovered through reading scraps of correspondence stored on a malfunctioning database, listening to audio logs, and interacting with an AI. I won't spoil any of how this plays out because I wanted to surprise you as much as it surprised me. All I'll say is that the game provides food for thought on a number of philosophical topics, and talking with the AI resulted in some of my favourite interactive dialogues I've had in the game all year. The asking price for the Talos Principle might seem steep, but if you like the sound of a lengthy puzzle game with a great narrative and world, I'd say it's worth every penny. War is hell, but you wouldn't know it from many of the games we play in war settings, which treat war as a backdrop for rollercoaster thrill ride campaigns and multiplayer team deathmatches. Some recent games have attempted to change that, such as Valiant Hearts and Spec Ops The Line, but this War of Mine is one of the first video games I've played that truly immerses you in the gritty, unpleasant and harrowing side of warfare. That's because this game has you controlling civilians trying to survive in a bombed-out shelter, and part of the game's impact comes from its emphasis on the human and mundane side of survival. There are weapons and a rudimentary combat system, but finding food to cook, wood to burn, and parts to build with is just as important as the number of bullets you have for your gun, if you're able to find or manufacture a gun. In fact, in most scenarios it's in your best interest not to kill people. One of my favourite things about this War of Mine is the mood system, where characters can become sad, depressed, and even suicidal if they are made to kill or feel they are responsible for the death or suffering of other people. So even if you are a heartless bastard who's happy to cave in the head of every poor schmuck you can get the jump on, doing so could traumatise your character and directly affect the morale of the group. It's the scavenging missions where this game really shines. They are tense to begin with as you creep around using a well-implemented stealth system, trying to salvage as much as your backpack can carry without being spotted. But they come into their own when they present you with moral dilemmas that take place in real time, putting you in the middle of difficult situations with no right way to respond to them. Do you stop a soldier from assaulting a young woman at risk to your own life? Do you steal from a defenceless old couple and leave them to starve without food? I won't spoil them all because it's best to let these scenarios surprise you. Unlike The Walking Dead, which would ask you to respond to these situations with a simple dialogue selection, this War of Mine always keeps you within the game's mechanics, allowing for a wider, more organic range of outcomes. You could stop the soldier assaulting the woman and get shot, or you could get away but with a bullet wound, allowing her a chance to escape but at an expense to your own medicine cabinet. Or you could sneak around and use the opportunity to scavenge for nearby resources. Or, if you have a weapon, you could step in and kill the soldier, or you could ignore the encounter entirely. It really is up to you, and as such, it feels all the more like a unique survival story created by your decisions. When you're down to your last survivor on day 41, who is severely ill, depressed, and hunched over a radio in the freezing cold of winter, praying to hear an announcement that the war is coming to an end, the game can feel extremely bleak. But the drive to get your group, or at least one of them, to see the end of the war is hugely compelling. As bizarre as it might seem, this game, which is far from what you would call fun in the traditional sense, ended up being one of the most addictive experiences of the year for me. Even with its randomised elements, this war of mine doesn't quite have the depth to withstand an extensive number of playthroughs, but the time I have spent with the game has stuck with me in a way that few games from this year have. I almost considered it for my game of the year, but there's one more game I played that just beat it to the post, so it's my second favourite game of 2014. Various pieces of notepaper with words and diagrams scrawled across them cover my desk. One is a series of numbers followed by the words time capsule code. Another is a noughts and crosses grid, which is drawn above a series of arrows and beneath instructions for all tramming pressure guidelines. Out of context, these notes look like the scribblings of a madman, but they are physical proof of the time I spent obsessed with White Paper Games' fantastic debut, Aether 1. Most of the puzzles in this first-person adventure game are entirely optional, and experiencing the game just for its narrative and atmosphere is worth the price of admission alone. I loved exploring the town of Pinwheel and its nearby harbour village, which are packed with detail and painted in a beautiful watercolour art style. The game is effortlessly atmospheric, and its environments are laid out in a way that creates a believable sense of place. Combine this with some wonderfully detailed sound design, which incorporates everything from the sound of distant seagulls to the subtle groaning of industrial machinery, and you have one of the most immersive games of the year. The narrative gives a strong sense of what the lives of the inhabitants of Pinwheel were like through notes, audio snippets, and environmental storytelling. Like the Vanishing of Ethan Carter, Aether 1 is full of surprising moments, and moves from tranquil exploration to hallucinatory set pieces with ease. Because the environment is so open, the plot is disorientating by design, and there's so much detail to process, I felt that some of the finer points of the overall narrative were occasionally a little muddled, but it still led to a great conclusion that I found both satisfying and powerful. So like I say, the story and environments alone are worth the price of admission, but the puzzles are what make this game my game of the year. Not only are they seamlessly integrated into the game's world, atmosphere and narrative, they are also challenging in the best possible way. These are puzzles that require you to pay attention, to obsess over small details, and to piece together its fractured environments through careful observation. I can see the obscurity of its puzzle solutions being frustrating for some players, and there were a few occasions where an aspect of a puzzle felt cheap and overly reliant on guesswork, yet the absence of hand-holding and the freedom it gives you to solve its puzzles at your own pace make figuring out the solutions incredibly satisfying. Like every game on this list, Aether 1 has faults, and while I would wholeheartedly recommend it, I can't promise that it will resonate with you as much as it did with me. But this is a game with some of the smartest puzzle design I've seen in games, a game with puzzles that don't disturb its wonderfully crafted environments and atmosphere, and a game with a story that I haven't been able to get out of my head since I finished it, with all 20 projectors completed. It is, in my opinion, an incredible debut effort from White Paper Games, and my game of the year for 2014. So those are my choices for my top 10 games of 2014. I'm looking forward to 2015. There's lots of games I'm very much looking forward to playing, but I hope that 2015 also has just as many surprises and interesting little games that come out of nowhere, just like 2014 did. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy 2015.